I did question my professional abilities every time I got fired. So all I felt I could do was keep trying because I really didn't have any plan B. I was very committed to being successful. And I also believed that deep down that my firings had less to do with my lack of talent than the political environments that I was in. I wasn't sure about that, but that was the sense I had. So I kept going.
Welcome to another episode of the Business 101 podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with John Follis, a true veteran of the US advertising industry who built one of Madison Avenue's most successful ad agencies, Follis and Verdi. However, despite the acclaim he now enjoys as one of Madison Avenue's fastest growing and finest products, John's story was neither easy nor convenient. In fact, in his first 7 years in the advertising industry, John got fired 4 times. But it is what he did with those initial failures that turned him from being a Madison Avenue reject to essentially a Hall of Famer in Madison Avenue. He did not just bounce back. Instead, he co-founded an agency that became a national powerhouse in just 3 years, eventually receiving personal honors from the White House for his public service. John has successfully sold everything from Coke to God, which is something we will come back to in this conversation. John's story is about grinding through challenges, building something from the ground up, and finding your stride where everything seems to go wrong. So join me today as I welcome John Follis. John, welcome to the Business 101 podcast.
Ayo, thank you so much for having me on your show. Look forward to our conversation today.
Yes. Thank you for coming on, John. And your story of getting fired 4 times in 7 years, which I think in itself is an achievement, and then going on to build a hugely successful Madison Avenue agency is like a real-world case study in resilience. And I think that's a good place for us to start. Can you walk me through essentially those early professional years of yours, talking through the setbacks, share some of the experiences, what happened, what led to some of those firings, and how did each one of them make you feel?
Yeah. It was very challenging. I really, you go to a good college and you learn all the things you need to learn to be a successful professional, but most colleges, as far as I know, don't have any courses in corporate politics.
Yeah.
And if you or any of your listeners have spent any time working at a company, especially a big company, and especially a big company in a big city, I think you or your listeners can appreciate what it's like dealing with corporate politics. And I was not prepared for that. And it's actually not that hard to get fired at a big agency because in many cases, the agency just has to lose a piece of business, an account, and they have to cut their overhead, which means cutting staff. So that's a pretty common experience. In my case, 2 of the 4 times I was terminated was directly related to the fact that the person who hired me at that company decided to leave for a better job within a matter of weeks after bringing me in. And I think it's pretty common understanding that if the person who brings you into any company is not there to help nurture you and help you grow and really protect you from some office politics, you're pretty vulnerable. It doesn't mean you're going to get fired in every case, but it definitely means you're vulnerable. And if you're working in an environment that's very, very competitive, there will be people that don't want you around. They don't want to compete against you. So that happened to me twice. I'm not sure about the other times, but again, it was related. I didn't know what it was related to. At the time it happened, I didn't have the perspective I have now. I thought it might have been related to the person not being there to protect me and other situations like that. Now looking back, I understand. And I also thought maybe it was the fact that I wasn't as talented as I thought I was. But, now that I can look back at my career in total, I realized that lack of talent was not the reason I was fired. It was really just for political reason. So that's what happened.
That's really interesting, and I do appreciate the introspection. You touched on something very important, which is when you spoke about corporate politics that's something that a lot of people, especially internationals, struggle with, when they move to the US and are trying to navigate big corporations in the US. So I think listeners would really find this important and useful. Touching a bit more on the rejections and the layoffs, right? I mean, after being laid off 4 times, most people would probably say, maybe this job is not for me.
Yeah.
Maybe I need to go figure out something else to do. So what was, the specific turning point or the mindset shift that happened that made you say, I think what I need to do is start my own agency? How did you come to that decision?
Well, every time I did lose my job, I did start asking myself those questions, right? And again, I didn't fully understand at the time what was going on. But I also was pretty convinced that I was talented because I wouldn't have been hired at the agency in the first place, if I wasn't talented. So I was hoping that maybe it had more to do with the environment and some of the people that I was dealing with. But I think it was maybe after the second time I got fired, while I was looking for a staff job, there were opportunities at different agencies to work on projects. Sometimes they weren't able to hire a full-time staff person, but if they liked my work, they might introduce me to the possibility of coming in for a project. They call it freelance in advertising. I don't know if it's so common in other industries, but if you're a creative person like I was working in advertising, going into a company for a short period of time to work in a freelance capacity is a very common thing. So what happened was, even though I may not have gotten a staff offer as quickly as I wanted, I did get a couple of invitations to get involved in freelance. And that actually was the beginning of what eventually allowed me to transition into working full time. Because every time I got fired, I just, again, started going with more enthusiasm to pick up freelance work, because go into a company and do freelance, you're really not exposed the way you are when you're on staff with corporate politics, right? You're an outside guy. You're only there for a short period of time, and my professional abilities every time I got fired. So all I felt I could do was keep trying, because I really didn't have any plan B. I was very committed to being successful. And I also believed that deep down that my firings had less to do with my lack of talent than the political environments that I was in. I wasn't sure about that, but that was the sense I had. So I kept going. But what allowed me to transition from a corporate environment to an entrepreneurial path was the fact that I started getting opportunities to do freelance work, which is, part-time, where you come in sometimes for a couple of weeks, sometimes just for a couple of days to help out a company. And that was working out really well. So every time I was in between jobs, I would find myself picking up some freelance. And every time I got fired again, I would go back to freelance again, to the point where I was starting to get so many freelance opportunities and being so successful with that. I finally decided, after the 4th time of getting fired, the hell with trying to get a staff job anymore. I'm just going to put all my eggs in this freelance basket and see if I could build up a company. It was shortly after I started doing that, Ayo, that I got a call out of the blue from a business guy who said, I've seen some of your work. I think you're terrific. I think we should get together and talk. I'd like to share some business ideas with you. And I said, about what? And he said, well, let's get together. I'll tell you. And 20 minutes after we met, he said, I think you're amazing. I think we should try to start an agency. He was a new business guy, by the way. He was like, I mean, I could tell when he was on the phone, he was very, very aggressive.
Yeah.
And that was his skill set. And he said, listen, your work is fantastic. I've seen your work around the city. I've heard fantastic things about you. And with your creativity and my salesmanship, I really think that if we gave it a shot, we can start an agency. So that's what we did, and that's what happened. We ended up collaborating, and within 6 months, we picked up a significant account that allowed us to start an agency.
Yes, well, I was actually just about to transition into that, but before I go there, I wanted to highlight something you said about just having the dogged belief that your layoffs had more to do with the political landscape in the corporate world than a lack of talent. And for a listener, maybe that's just one of the key ingredients to succeeding in any industry, just having that dogged belief that you have talent and you can succeed. Thank you so much for sharing that. So now let's talk a bit about your firm, right? You literally went from being out of a job to having one of the most successful ad agencies in New York in 3 years. So for listeners who are aspiring founders, that's such an incredible growth story. So I guess my question is, what were the absolute non-negotiables, or more so the core strategies that you implemented early on in the business that allowed you to scale at such a rapid scale?
It was more of a matter of survival, to be honest with you. I mean, I didn't go to business school. I had no big strategic plan. I just got a call from this guy who said, I think we ought to try to start an agency. And I figured, well, I had nothing to lose. Let me give him some samples of my work. And if he wants to start making some phone calls and try to get some meetings, let's see what happens. So it was really as simple as that. And I didn't even know if I liked the guy, but I said, well, let's see if we could find some work so we could at least collaborate on some things and get to know each other and see where it goes. So it was really that simple, Ayo. I think that what the important thing was that my work was, to say it was creative is kind of an understatement. It was very bold. It was the kind of work that would get some clients nervous because it was very different. There's a term that we use in advertising. It's very edgy. And I don't know if you know what that means, but it's provocative would be a way to describe it. Very provocative. And a lot of people that I worked at big agencies, account people, they would never be okay with that kind of work because they always wanted to kind of present work to the clients that wouldn't ruffle any feathers, right? This business guy was very different. He actually got excited when he saw the kind of provocative work. So the fact that he really believed in that kind of work, I think and tried to find clients that also believed in that kind of work. So, if you're dealing with another entrepreneurial business and they don't have a big advertising budget, if they're smart, they realize that with their limited budget, they have no choice but to try to do something provocative.
Exactly. You have to take risks.
And so the fact that not only did he believe in that philosophy of work, but that we were able to find clients that also agreed with that philosophy is what enabled us to start picking up work pretty quickly. And the fact of the matter, I mean, if the work we did wasn't successful, we obviously wouldn't have grown. But the first account that we got, the work was so successful that after 3 or 4 months, he was spending going back decades. I'm 70. I'll be 71 in 5 days. So we're going back a long time. But back in 1988, our first client was spending $350,000 on a TV spot. $350K now would be at least twice that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Almost a million.
And so he ran a commercial that we came up with, and 3 months later, it was so successful. He called us up and he said, listen, I want to double our budget.
Wow.
And he dug up, I don't know where he got the money, but he found another $500,000. I think he had to double mortgage his house or something like that. But because there was such a direct result to the ad campaign that we were doing and the results that he was getting, to him it was a no-brainer to just pour more money into TV media and continue running the spot for another 6 months or a year. So again, because the work that we did was very successful and worked out really well for our clients, then we were able to, leverage that, use that as a great case study, and use that to try to, to grease the wheels to get more business. And that's what happened.
Wow. And even despite those initial wins, I'm sure you faced some insane competition. I mean, one of my professors would say that competition is a textbook idea until you go to New York, right? And once you take our firm, industries like banking, on Wall Street and maybe Silicon Valley, it doesn't get more competitive than, advertising, Madison Avenue.
Right.
And so let's talk a bit about some of the biggest business challenges that you faced as an owner. Immediately the business took off and began to grow. You then had to start acquiring more clients, attracting and retaining talent, things like that, managing finances, trying to stay afloat. How did you go from this ad guy to a business owner where you had to think about things like...
Yeah. So as I may have mentioned earlier, I was the creative guy.
Okay.
So besides my partner being a good business development guy, he also had a business background. So when we were collaborating, because my name was on the door and I was a 50% partner, I was extremely interested in the business side, but that wasn't my focus. So he would just be getting meetings, and oftentimes it wasn't a given that we had the business. The way it usually worked, Ayo, was that we would be given an opportunity to pitch the business. The clients would always want to see what kind of work we would do for them. So it's very common in the ad industry where if it's any kind of significant account, there will be multiple agencies pitching. Like the first account we had, even though it wasn't a huge client, I think there were 4 other agencies. And these were bona fide ad agencies. We were 2 guys working out of our apartments, you know.
Right.
So that was usually what would happen. We would pitch, and in many cases we won, but not always. So that was it. I had my hands full, just working kind of full time, trying to do the kind of work that would not only win the business, but also be successful campaign, be an effective campaign for the client. And if it wasn't effective, it doesn't matter how creative it is. It has to work.
Yes.
But, unlike most creative people, I was extremely interested in the business, maybe because my father was a successful business guy. So I kind of grew up hearing about business around the kitchen at the dinner table every night. And I always wanted to know what was going on with the finances and the business, which I have to tell you caused a lot of friction with my partner, because he was the kind of guy that said, no, you're the creative guy. You stay in your office and come up with the great ideas. Let me deal with the business side. And that didn't work for me. My name was first on the door, and I wanted to know everything about the business. Not that I had to be as involved with it as he did, but I certainly wanted to be involved with it. So I have to tell you, eventually that was the reason we broke up, because he thought I was getting too involved with the business side of things. And he didn't like that. So eventually, after about 4 years, I had to actually sue him for breach of contract. Because our business agreement said that all major business decisions have to be mutual, and that wasn't happening. It was unfortunate. I wanted to discuss it with him and just try to come up with an amicable understanding. But, like any kind of relationships, they don't last forever sometimes, and it's not uncommon that happens. So only about 5 years after we were together, I found myself being having to run my own business, and I didn't know that I could survive because I didn't go to business school like you. But I learned a lot just by being in business for those 4 years. And my attitude was, let me see how far I can go on my own. And if I crash and burn, then I guess I'll just be forced to try to get a job somewhere.
Yeah.
And that ended up being about 25 years on my own.
Oh, we keep coming back to the same theme of just having dogged and blind faith and just being willing to chug it out and see what, where it's going to lead. What's the worst thing that could happen mindset. And just before we leave, the conversation around Follis and Verdi, do you have any, advice there about, for young people who are trying to look into starting businesses and are thinking about how to bring in a partner and things like that? Is there any advice that, things to look out for, how to know if it's going to be a mismatch or if it's going to be a good match? What do you think?
Well, it's not any different than trying to find a spouse. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You got to date a lot of people.
Yeah.
And then if you see someone you think you can be compatible with, then you got to try it out. In our case, it was kind of crazy. I don't know if you're familiar with the term shotgun wedding, but you kind of get someone pregnant before you're ready to get married. So we got pregnant before we were ready to get married because we picked up this account. There was a big account, and we hadn't really spent, in my opinion, enough time to really decide whether or not we were a good fit. But we, before we knew it, we had this account. We decided we had to formalize the partnership. But to answer your question, I would just suggest try to figure out ways that you could collaborate before you make it an official legal commitment, because no one wants to get any kind of divorce. You don't want to have to sue your partner. You don't want to have to go through a divorce. So figure out how you can maybe work on some projects together and just get a sense of how you guys get along with one another. And I think that's what you can try to do.
That's definitely incredible advice. Thanks for sharing. And now let's transition to some of the more, interesting parts of your experience that I actually love. Besides the commercial side, the public service work, particularly the Selling Good campaign, led to some very remarkable recognition, including at the White House and the UN. From a business perspective, right, I want you to talk through some of the strategic approaches behind that campaign and what entrepreneurs can learn from that move in terms of creating impact. And as you speak through those, if you could just chip in anything you find interesting or remarkable about that experience, I would want to learn about that.
Yeah. Well, I just have to correct something you said, Ayo. The work that got me honored at the White House and then 6 months later at the United Nations was not a campaign that I did for this church that I call Selling God. It was for work that I did with child abuse prevention.
Okay.
During my career, I probably have worked on close to 36 nonprofit causes. I have always believed that if I was able to find the time while I was working on my paying clients, that I should try to do as much public service and give back as much as I could. So I don't know which one you want me to talk about first, but since you referenced the White House and the UN,
Yes.
that would be the
Yes.
child abuse campaign. Yeah. So that was a fluke. That was a fluke, I have to say. A series of coincidences that it's hard to say in just a few minutes, but I'll try to give you the nutshell. On my own, I just happened to be watching TV one night and come across a documentary about Hitler that mentioned that Hitler was abused as a kid.
Yes.
Which at the time I didn't know. We're talking many years ago. Some people may know that now. I think it's pretty common knowledge now, but at the time, we're talking years ago, I didn't know that. And being the creative advertising guy that I am, when I heard that fact, I said, what an interesting fact. I wonder if I could leverage this into some kind of a public service ad for child abuse. I said, I don't know exactly how I would do it, but any great ad, or I should say most great ads, come out with a very interesting fact.
Yes.
If you look at the best advertising, all of it is really based on a very interesting fact about the product or service, if you can find one. So starting with that fact, I then spent the next couple of months on my own, just trying to come up with an ad, which I did. It took a while. And then when I showed it to my partner, when I finally found something that I was happy with, my partner went crazy. He said, this is one of the best ads I've ever seen. This is brilliant. And being the great sales guy that he was, he said, let's see if we can sell it. Now, that's an ass backwards way of doing it. Normally, you don't come up with the ad and then try to find a client. Usually you have the client and you do what they want. So he started making some phone calls, and the National Committee for Child Abuse Prevention in Chicago, he called them up. It was very weird. I don't know exactly what he said, because we didn't want to just send them the ad. We wanted to have a meeting where we could set up the presentation and all this stuff. And it was just a sheer coincidence that they told us they were coming to New York for a meeting. And they said, so when we come to New York, you could show us your, we did send them some other samples of some of my public service work. So they were impressed with some work that we did. And they said, well, now you've got us really curious. We'd love to see what you come up with for us. They told us that they were having a meeting at the offices of the NBA, the National Basketball Association. And that's where we should meet them, which was very strange, because I don't know what child abuse had to do with NBA, but we go up to their offices and we not only find ourselves meeting with them, but we find ourselves in a room with about 7 executives from the NBA sitting around a conference table, which was very weird, because I have an ad featuring Adolf Hitler, and I'm showing a bunch of basketball people who don't even know why we're there, to be honest with you. We were just invited by the child abuse. I thought it was going to be a private meeting with them. Very strange. We show them the ad with Hitler. They get freaked out and said, well, we can't run this.
Exactly. I was expecting that.
And then they say, but we think you guys are very talented creatively. What we didn't know, Ayo, was that the reason they were meeting with the NBA is they were negotiating a deal that would allow them to, if they had some TV commercials, to run some TV commercials during the NBA playoff games that year, where the LA Lakers with Magic Johnson was playing against Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls.
Yeah.
So you can imagine what it would be like to have a commercial running during that time. And the NBA was offering these guys back in 1991, $5 million worth of TV media time. So again, today that would be like, I don't know, 12, 13, 14 million dollars.
Yeah.
And I'm talking over like what, an NBA series is what, a month, maybe,
Yeah.
depending on whether it goes 5 games or 7 games or whatever. It could be 3 weeks, it could be 5 weeks. So imagine that kind of money. So they said, listen, do you guys do TV? And we said, yeah. And they said, well, would you be interested in trying to be? The other thing was we were on a time schedule. They needed to find someone immediately. So because of the time situation that they were faced with and the fact that we just happened to be a New York ad agency sitting in a room and they thought we were talented creatively, we got the opportunity to come up with a series of TV commercials that would run during the NBA playoffs. And I did. I had like a week and a half to come up with a campaign, came up with these ideas. They liked them. They ran them. They ran like crazy during every game. They must have run 7 or 8 times a game. And a month, they were so successful. The NBA, they said, we're getting phone calls from fans saying, we love these commercials you've done for child abuse prevention. In the 20 years of all the public service ads we've done with the NBA, we've never had any kind of response like this. And then a month later, I get a letter in the mail from the White House saying, we'd like to invite you to a reception.
Wow.
For the work you did on child abuse. And how these TV spots got on the radar of the White House, all I can figure out is that the president at the time was watching the NBA playoffs and probably said, hey, we got to find out who did these great, because they wanted, at the time, the White House had a program where they were honoring Americans around the country who were involved in various social causes and nonprofit initiatives. And the program was to try to honor people who were involved in these different programs. And so they tracked me down, and I was one of a couple of dozen people invited to this White House reception to be honored. So that's
incredible. And just before we now talk about the Selling God campaign, I just want to digress a little bit. Back in the 80s, there was no ChatGPT. In fact, there was no internet. How were you churning out this creative work, especially under such tight time crunches?
You went to Duke for business. I went to Syracuse for advertising. Syracuse University has one of the best advertising, media, communication schools in the country, probably the world. And that's where I graduated. And in addition to that, while I was working in New York, I also went to night school and took classes at one of the best schools in New York, the School for Visual Arts. And that program during the evening had instructors who were working, advertising people, working at some of the top agencies in New York who were teaching classes at night. So that kind of bolstered my professional creative talents. I got excited whenever I had an opportunity to work with any kind of a client on any kind of a project, whether it was a TV commercial or, again, there was no internet at the time. So it was traditional media, it would be TV, radio, print, billboards, that kind of stuff. But that was my thing, coming up with great creative ideas. And I would get excited, especially when you have an opportunity to work on something that's important, like child abuse prevention. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That just adds to the excitement to do something that can really make a positive difference in people's lives, Yeah.
And we would have thought that it was, a work that was more so like a pro bono, job that would give you this kind of recognition in the White House. It just goes to say that, one has to always support their mind. So thanks for sharing that. If you could speak a little about the Selling God campaign, I found that very interesting about your profile. I want to hear about that.
Were you able to track it down and take a look at some of the
work
or look at the case study at all?
I read that and I'm like, okay, I need to ask you about that.
Yeah. Okay, so I call it Selling God. When I was in New York, I got involved with a church.
Okay.
It's one of the biggest churches in New York, still exists. It's called the Marble Collegiate Church. It's actually got a national reputation. So one thing I liked about the church was that it really had a lot of programs and activities. It wasn't just the the minister's sermon on Sunday. They would have all kinds of programs at divorce recovery. They even had an entrepreneur group. Just a lot of programs and activities that really kind of helped people on any number of things. And that's one of the things I really enjoyed about the church. They even had a singles group where young people could get a chance to get to know each other. When I moved to New York, I knew no one. So one of the reasons I went to the church was to try to make some friends, you know, maybe a nice woman and go on do activities and stuff.
Yeah.
About 15 years after I was involved with the church, I found out from one of the ministers that they were thinking of doing an ad campaign. And so when they found out that I was at the time running this successful Madison Avenue advertising agency, they wanted to talk to me about the possibility of doing some advertising for the church. So the minister came up to my office, which was very weird because the last time, the time I would see the minister is when I'm sitting in the pew and he's up there giving a sermon. Suddenly I'm at my desk and he's sitting in front of me, like pitching the fact that he needs help with advertising. Mm-hmm. So it was a little bit strange, but one of the first things he told me was, he said, listen, I just found out from my financial guy that we have $150,000 to spend in about a 3-month period. And again, this was back decades ago. $150,000 in 3 months would probably be 2 or 3 times that now. I was shocked. What church has
that much money?
$150,000 to spend in 3 months, never mind 3 times that. So he said, listen, I'd like to see what you would do. And he said, but listen, here's our issue. This is our problem. We don't have a lot of young people at our church. And for our church to continue to thrive and just exist, we need to keep young people coming to our church. And he said, at the time, I think I was in my late 50s and the minister was in his mid 60s. So I said, I think you probably understand how young New Yorkers think. This campaign would just be running in New York City. So I said, I have a feeling, and you know the church, you've been involved with the church for 20 years. So I said, I can't imagine a better fit for someone to try to come up with an ad campaign and try to attract these people. So let's see what you come up with. And I came up with 2 campaigns, one that was pretty conservative because it was a church, and then one that was pretty provocative that I thought was a better campaign, but I thought he would be too afraid to run. And I presented both campaigns and he said, let me think about it. And a week later came back and I was totally shocked when he said, we like the provocative campaign. I think he showed his kids. I think he had kids who were about my age, in their 30s. Yeah. And I think that was the tipping point. He probably said, listen, we're going after young people. He said, I'm not sure about this. Ask his kids, what do you guys think about this? And they probably said, oh, that's great. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. I don't know for sure, but I'm sure he ran it by some people in their 20s and 30s. And of course, they're going to like the more creative, edgy campaign. So that's the campaign that he ran. And it started getting all kinds. We were running on subways and things like that. In New York City, $150K is not a lot of money, but over a 3-month period, if you target it in certain media channels, like we were mainly on subways and some billboards and things like that, you can make an impact. And it got a nice write-up in the New York Times, and we were on a couple of TV shows, a couple of news shows talking about it. Suddenly young folks were coming into the church, and a lot of them said the reason they were coming to the church was because they saw the ads and they were curious. So became another great case study. And it was probably the longest relationship I had with any client. The average agency client relationship, I think, is about 2.5 years because clients are very fickle. They have some turnover in management and they bring in a new ad agency, Yeah. I had that church client for 16 years. Wow.
That's no longer a business arrangement. It's more like a, family. You're almost like family at that point. I'm sure you guys shared a couple of coffees together and dinner.
The other thing related to this that you'll appreciate, I got a call from a publisher, Prentice Hall Publishing, major publisher.
Yeah.
And they said, listen, one of our authors of a marketing textbook has informed us that he would like to include your church campaign in this marketing textbook that we're doing. It's called Principles of Marketing. It's going to go to like 100,000. We're printing, the initial printing is 100,000 copies. We're going into about 200 or 300 colleges and universities across the U.S. It's going to be published in 6 months, and he wants to include your church campaign as a case study in this marketing book. Is that okay with you? I said, can you get me a couple of free copies of the book? And they said, sure, no problem.
Let's do this.
So it became a featured case in Principles of Marketing, a marketing textbook published by Prentice also. That was cool too.
That's some good work. And yeah, everyone can go check it out. John has an incredible array of exceptional work that he's done, and I myself will be checking out the book after now. But John, you're not just a retired business person. You clearly had an eye for future trends, right? And now looking back at how advertising has evolved from traditional Madison Avenue, styles and standards of advertising to today's very digital-led landscape are some of the timeless principles that you've seen time and again in Madison Avenue, but more so generally across businesses. So think about principles for business growth, effective marketing that still hold true today, regardless of the technology,
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that the technology, as time progresses, is always going to continue to evolve and allow you to do more different things faster, easier, more interesting, especially with AI right now. But the basic principles of marketing will never change. You have to make sure that you understand who your right target audience is. And then you have to figure out the best way to connect with that audience with a message that's going to be compelling enough to get them to respond. It's really that simple. So that's never going to change. The tools that you use to do that will always continue to evolve, but the basic foundational principles of marketing will always be the same. Does that
It does make sense to me. And I feel like that is reflective across industries. It's the same in business. It's the same in consulting, right? It's the same end goal. The way you get to that goal might change, and the tools that make it possible to get to that goal might change, but you have to keep the big goal in mind, and that would almost never change. So yes, that does make sense to me. So now as we begin to kind of wrap up the conversation, John, if you could go back in time and have a coffee chat, so to speak, with your younger self, specifically the version of you that got fired that fourth time, right? What single piece of pragmatic advice would you offer him about starting or growing a business?
I would say that your suspicions that the bullshit you had to deal with in the corporate environment were accurate.
Yep.
And that you really are very talented, and you just have to find the right environment and the right people that recognize your talent to be successful. So don't give up. Keep fighting. Keep looking for opportunities and the kind of people that can recognize your talent and embrace your talent. That's what I would say.
Got it. And finally, my final question to you is this. If you could take a holistic look at your career, from those very tough beginnings to eventually building this very successful advertising agency and receiving national honors, what would you say is the single most important lesson you've learned about dealing with difficulties in business and turning things around, making a business thrive?
Well, it really comes down to attitude. I think it's like anything. You have to be committed to being the best. I think I read once that Michael Jordan was cut from his high school basketball team.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at any successful person, I think Oprah Winfrey said she was fired a couple of times and told that she would never succeed in TV. So this is a common theme with every successful person. Yeah. The difference between a successful person and the non-successful person is that the successful person didn't allow those experiences to get them off track. Do you know what I'm saying? To change their focus. So you just have to really make a decision of what your goal is and just be willing to do whatever it takes to reach that goal.
Thank you so much for sharing, John. I really appreciate all your wisdom and the insights that you brought to the conversation. And that's unfortunately all the questions that we have time for today. Again, thank you for taking time to speak with me. For the audience, see you guys on another episode of the Business 101 podcast, and we've been speaking to John Follis. Thank you again for coming, John.
Thank you. Fun to be on your show.
Thank you.